Salutations. So, firstly, did I get a nose ring in order to impress a woman? 1000% yes. Did it work? Yeah. Just a disclaimer, I am apolitical. I am purely interested in analysis and an appreciation that my analysis does nothing concrete or meaningful beyond this video being uploaded onto YouTube for your entertainment and my creative outlet. I am fortunate and cozy enough to sit in my ivory tower, and I am complacently resigned to do so. Who knows, perhaps someday this will change. When I therefore say capitalism is an absolute necessity, this does not mean I am right-wing or liberal. It does, however, mean that I am a capitalist, but only insofar as I like to buy things. I'm pro-wage labour, and believe that the history of capitalism is a complex, harrowing, but also a pretty remarkable one, which ought to be properly and contextually spoken about. I am in awe of history, meaning that it amazes, but it also frightens me, and capitalism is a key part of that history. This is what I am interested in, and only this. But hold, just before we get into that, it's time to give a huge thank you to our sponsorship, Wren. You know, one of the things that I love about capitalism is how interestingly it can mutate and change and embed according to particular needs and situations. It can, relatively quickly, embed itself in new methods of production and consumer relations. And this creative destruction is a driving force of capitalism, and is why it is so effective and has been with us for such a long period of our history. Contemporarily, creative destruction has been used simply for profit, and what a waste of creative potential that has been. I mean, what is the point of the smartwatch, aside from making profit and undermining the delicate and beautiful art of horology? Watchmakers, I got you. But sometimes the creative possibilities of capitalism lead to something pretty remarkable. It can lead to innovations of considerable use, urgency, and consumer value. And that's where a benefit corporation like Wren comes into the picture. Unlike the all too well-known ineffectiveness and secrecy of governments and mega corporations in their climate strategies, which always comes second to profit, of course, Wren is the ultimate example of what a corporation in the 21st century ought to be. Wren is for anybody who wants to tackle the climate crisis but doesn't know where to start. And all you need to do is follow a few easy steps in measuring your personal carbon footprint. Wren's legally binding charter places your money and the planet ahead of profit making and its competitors. For instance, one project that I have been following quite intently is Wren's community tree planting project. And this is measured in real time and on the ground, meaning that every single individual tree is not only recognized as a unique individual tree in and of itself, yes, acacia, but is also measured in order to determine how much carbon is sequestered over time. And what I especially love about this project is that not only are 1,000 farmers in East Africa joining in this project, but your money also goes to providing each farmer with a supplemental income stream. This month, Wren has focused its resources and its funding in 4 main projects, including community tree planting. And in a single month, Wren is responsible for enabling the planting of 30,000 trees. Like Wren, I appreciate that planting trees is not going to save the planet or end the climate crisis, but it is vital to a solution in the here and now. A live feed and yearly financial reports give me all the information that I need about where my money is going and what it is doing. So if you want to A, calculate your carbon footprint, B, use that information to become carbon neutral, and C, actually do something impactful, meaningful, and long-term about the climate crisis, not just for you, but for the planet and the world at large, then please go to the link that I have in my description box and have put in a pinned comment down below in order to access all the information that you need to get started. And the first 100 people who sign up using my link will have 10 extra trees planted in their name. How sweet is that? A sweet deal indeed. Thank you so very much to Wren for sponsoring this video. So, let us begin. You know, there are some hard truths that I have personally had to come to terms with, and I think at some point in our lives we all do. On the weekend, I was doing some bus traveling all over my county looking for a new home, and I was listening to the most beautiful soundtrack, and I was also reading Crime and Punishment, and I was enjoying myself so much because it was sunny. I was in a bus driving through the British countryside at a very leisurely pace, listening to beautiful, exquisite music, reading a book that I absolutely am enthralled by. And I guess it dawned on me that I would not be in that situation, in that bus, listening to that particular music, reading that particular book, if it had not been for how my personal history had played out. If I had not been raised white, if I had not been shipped off to England against my will, if I had not been taught and grounded in English and English alone, I didn't have the access to books, to libraries, and most importantly to the internet back home, which I have in England. And when I look at it, it is as if I am two different people in one. I am who I was in South Africa and who I am in England now. And so I asked myself this question: knowing what you now know about the world, about literature, music, art, about so many things, should you acknowledge that none of this would have been possible without all those things which have caused you so much pain and confusion, would not have been possible without what is socially deemed overarching oppressive structures and systems? The truth of the matter is no, and that's a very tough pill for me to swallow. The quite messed up contradiction in that is that I am able to critique my life, critique my upbringing, critique the society around me, because that has given me the arsenal in order to do so. It's difficult for me to admit that my making a video being very critical of my experience as somebody who was transracially adopted was only made possible by the fact that I was transracially adopted. I went to school, got on the internet, went to university, accessed YouTube, understood how to edit a video, to record, all these things, because I was transracially adopted in essence. And so in this video, I would like to argue one such truth. Man, I'm not going to miss that. And so in this video, I would like to argue one such hard truth. Capitalism is not only here for good, well, at least for this century, but it is an absolute necessity unless dramatic sacrifices that we take for granted are discarded indefinitely. The secondary points that I'll be focusing on are as follows. A. Capitalism is necessary to much of the politics which is ironically opposed to it. B. Capitalism is mutable, which is what makes it unique, necessary, and inescapable. And finally, if it wasn't for the sui generis nature of capitalism, particularly insofar as it manifested in the latter part of the 20th century, the self-determination at the core of human rights movements throughout history and presently would not have been nearly as morally comprehensible as they are today. So let's start with my favorite bit of every single video, which is definitions. And this is because I think that we have really become quite complacent in defining capitalism because of, well, these two hairy gods. And their definition is the standard definition. Capitalism is a mode of production based on the private ownership of the means of production, extraction of surplus value by the owning class for the purpose of capital accumulation, wage-based labor, and at least as far as commodities are concerned, being market-based. And in being defined as a mode of production, capitalism is rightly understood by this definition to be an economic system. And this is very important because an economic system differs entirely from an ideology, specifically a political ideology, which is often what capitalism is deemed to be. Especially now, it is sort of given the status of being a political ideology wrongly. And this is where much of the confusion inevitably comes in. The closest that capitalism comes to being an ideology is in being an economic ideology, because it is an economic system, it has economic principles, and those are applied, and obviously they derive from ideas, specifically from Adam Smith. However, I do think that this would still be pushing it a bit, because the fact that capitalist principles are accepted globally, bar North Korea, is a testament to the fact that capitalism is not an ideology, that it is not ideological in and of itself, considering how many ideologies inform the politics of the modern world. And in this world, capitalism reigns, but only as an economic structuring. What we also need to appreciate is that this definition of capitalism applies and is relevant less and less to our time and context. The context from which the above definition derives much of its key points was defined by industry and ought to simply be used to define industrial capitalism. And context is integral to capitalism, which is why there are so many variants of it throughout history and even presently. A more useful definition of capitalism would appreciate its various manifestations across the global economy as it applies and relates today. It would also appreciate the particularity of context. So what we need to do with a more accurate definition of capitalism is move from a statement such as capitalism is bad and it caused the Great Recession to this: neoliberal capitalism is bad because it ideologically justifies the near complete deregulation of finance, and it caused the Great Recession after neoliberally minded political elites had been ideologically driven to advertise and create a property-owning democracy in order to garner votes as a consequence of a very unintentional loss of political power to an out-of-control financial class since the end of the Cold War. I did write that. And yes, that is long, but that is also the point. Capitalism is complex, it's contextual, and it is rigorously networked. And this is often done in ways and manifests itself in ways that are incomprehensible at just first observation, or even with the greatest knowledge and understanding of finance, of the economy, of a specific economy, etc. Capitalism is definitionally a system, but in practice it is nuanced beyond anything that any preceding system or ideology could ever have comprehended and dreamed of. And this is, in my opinion, its substantial advantage over any other economic system. But more on that when we establish an ideal typical definition of capitalism as it applies today. And so, what have we established thus far? What the history of capitalism shows is that human societies are not as systematic and as rigid as the Marxian definition of capitalism would suggest. And this definition is regrettably taken as law. Human societies are composed of multiple overlapping networks of interaction, of which 4 networks, ideological, economic, military, and political power relations, are the most important. And these dynamics are orthogonal, meaning that they interact with one another, but not in a systematic way, and not in a consistent way either. And what this means is that the development of capitalism is influenced by states, by politics, and by ideology. And so trying to define it without reference to these historical, these political, these national specificities and nuances is very disingenuous, and it undermines a fully fledged understanding of what capitalism truly is. And now, for an accurate, historically specific, and very particular definition of capitalism as it applies to our context today. And I'm talking about capitalism insofar as it has flourished, I don't mean that in a positive way, in Western societies. As I said, the advantage of capitalism is that its definition is literally impossible to pin down consistently. There are key principles which underlie it, but as I said, it needs to be understood in an orthogonal way. And so any working definition needs to appreciate the very specific nature of our exposure to capitalism. And that exposure is largely situated under the heading financial or finance capitalism. And this definition is very important in distinguishing between between the different eras of capitalism. Merchant capitalism, modern capitalism, from early modern capitalism to late modern capitalism, industrial capitalism, ending with Keynesian democracy and corporate industrial capitalism until about 1973, and financial capitalism, really taking off at the beginning of the 1980s and largely defined by neoliberal democracy gaining credibility during the 1973 to 1980 transition period away from Keynesian democracy. And these are just four very broad categorizations and chunks of capitalism as it manifested. And within that, there are incredible variants. And this is important because I see that we contemporarily use capitalism as a sort of blanket term to define anything and everything that is suspicious. That this overarching capitalism is at the root of growing inequality and corruption. And yes, contemporarily we exist within a system defined by financial capitalism. But this variant of capitalism is in a very one-sided, unhealthy, and what we would contemporarily call toxic marriage to neoliberalism. And its ideas derive from the founding of the Mont Pelerin Society in 1947. And this society was highly influential, and it consisted of the greatest American and Western European economists, philosophers, politicians, business mongols, the lot. Their equivalent to scripture was and remains to this day Hayek's The Road to Serfdom. And as somebody who personally is not terribly amused by democracy as we see it today, I would argue that the manifestation of capitalism under the iron hammer of neoliberalism has been fairly undemocratic. I say this because it is evident that the democratically elected class are subservient to an ever-increasing power of finance and its demands. This is due to a vital flaw inherent of neoliberalism. It assumes that the absolute freedom of individuals and markets operates well because individuals are rational and good. However, as time has progressed from the 1980s, neoliberalism tries to compensate for the fact that it is anything but, with an extensive emphasis on liberality. What I mean is that we have become more neoliberal to the extent that it is just taken for granted. In short, while neoliberalism has clearly widened inequalities and has failed quite miserably when it comes to being of economic or socio-economic success, it has been very successful in its ideological influence, namely its ability to justify a placing of the individual at the center of absolutely everything. And this has quite uniquely to any ideology preceding it worked very successfully as a buffer to what historically would have been sort of revolutionary outrage to such growing socio-economic inequalities and disenchantment. Because what we can see under finance capitalism is that there is an ever-increasing and blatant disalignment between enfranchisement on the one hand and socio-economic inequalities on the other, which, as history shows, generally ensues into revelatory action, into stark violence. What distinguishes capitalism as it is today relative to what it was as little as 40 years ago is what I mentally like to dub the Regina George-ification of capitalism. Let us suppose that Caddy Jane Heron is capitalism and Regina George is the amalgamation and consequences of neoliberal policies deregulation that began in England and the United States and ensued into the havoc-like open season and boom of the financial sector. Caddy shows great kindness and goodness, but this is largely overshadowed and undermined by the unhealthy influence of Regina George over her character and decisions as we progress through the movie. Importantly, however, Caddy isn't Regina, even though the whole high school finds it easier to group her, Regina, Gretchen, and Karen, rather misleadingly and disingenuously together as the plastics. Similarly, neoliberalism is not capitalism, even though the two have very specifically come together in the interest of finance. Neoliberal capitalism has basically made itself synonymous to finance capitalism. Financialization is at the core of this. Finance capitalism defines a shift from savings capitalism to pump capitalism, a shift from the centrality of wage labor to speculating on the ever-increasing indebtedness of individuals and states, a shift from investment for productive purposes to speculative investment, a shift from long-term stable investment and stock holding to risk-laden short-term ones, a shift from a widespread trust in municipal savings banks and cooperative banks aligned to traditional banking ethics and business towards the aggressive takeover of banking business by hedge funds, investment banks, investment funds, over-the-counter private equity companies, capital investment and holding companies, a shift from a lengthy history of low growth to our sudden obsession with high growth. Under finance capitalism, capital serves speculation and high-stakes gain and risks. The mathematicalization and digitalization of speculative transactions has led to an economy in which money managers have acted not only as driving forces, but increasingly also as driven entities addicted to their own techniques and ever stiffer competition. Finance capitalism has encompassed itself with neoliberal ideology in a way that politicians and the political class have either just taken as being the case or are so disempowered in comparison to that they inevitably are subservient to it. The most stark example of this is the European Union, specifically under the influence of Germany. And I guess to just simplify that very dramatically, finance capitalism is essentially the predominance no longer of traditional, conventional banking, business, and ethics and its systems, but that rather of the shadow banking system. And this banking system is not at all the same as your traditional commercial banks. And this is because the shadow banking system is able to operate beyond traditional banking regulations. And in a business sense, what this represents when we leave Wall Street, when we leave the city of London and go into, say, retail, is that there has been a dramatic transference of power relations, and decision-making capabilities from the level of management within a business to that of investors and shareholders, whose power has increased beyond anything imaginable. The bank, often closely linked with a production, trade, or service enterprise in a long-term relationship, saw to it that there was managerial autonomy, since the bank was less interested in short-term profits than it was in long-term success, and it therefore backed management with credit, among other things, even in opposition to stockholder interests, especially in Germany and Japan. And boy, how things have changed. Finance does not equal capitalism, akin to how free enterprise does not equal capitalism. They're often seen as synonymous, but they are not. You can have a free market without capitalism, similarly to how you can have capitalism without free enterprise. And I think that this can be seen in looking at history itself, the best place to look for anything, really. Prior to the 1980s, shareholders were so dispersed and so small that their power was rarely well managed and hardly noticeable. They hardly ever threatened the production, the trade, or the services which they had stakes in. And because of this, the running of a business was independent from shareholders' influence. And importantly, it was also regulated by commercial banking interests, meaning that long-term incentives and initiatives were prioritized over short-term ones, and especially over short-term profit. And because commercial banks and the credit which they had invested into a business were prioritized, because their very traditional and commercialized business interests were kind of sacrosanct, this meant that reinvestment was king. We can call this, broadly speaking, savings capitalism or managerial capitalism. And this existed up until the 1980s. And and was a key part of, at least in America, the Great Society. And the interesting part about this era of capitalism was that shareholders were relatively satisfied with their returns on their investments, even if it wasn't the highest possible profit that could have been gained. This was because management was autonomous from shareholders and their immediate interests. It was in management's best interest, insofar as having an allegiance to commercial banking regulations, to, as Coker writes, reinvest large portions of the profits made rather than distribute them to owners, which strengthened management's relative autonomy vis-a-vis the capital market. What we see today is a consequence of the power and influence of shareholders and investors rising, as well as that of virtually a very, very new form of banking, investment banking. And so what we see now is a very stark shift away from savings capitalism. As the power of investment banking and of shareholders has risen, the logic and volatility of capital markets influencing the decisions, the policies, and the strategies of companies has become direct, whereas previously it was indirect. Under savings or managerial capitalism, that is the manifestation of capitalism prior to the onset of neoliberal ideology's dominance over it, it was taboo for capital markets to have such an immediate, direct, and penetrative influence over the running of day-to-day business. And what this means is that business, at least successful, large-scale, macroeconomic business, is now rather illogical and volatile. And with this has come things which we see contemporarily at a greater level than has ever been the case: food waste, production waste, and overproduction, rising greenhouse emissions, encouraging and prioritizing indebtedness, largely through mortgage loans and easy access to credit, which leads to excessive leverage. The market becomes more ubiquitous and more compulsive under neoliberalism and financialization. Room to maneuver for individual company managements is shrinking. Enterprises are becoming more like one another. The influence of the bank is declining. The representatives of the funds exercise control, but they are simultaneously controlled. They demand permanent accounting, which they must permanently render themselves. In New York, the average investor would hold onto their stocks for 6 to 8 years in the 1960s. Right now, the average investor will hold onto their stock for no more than 12 months. Important decisions, from that of pay cuts to redundancies, are no longer within the domain of management. Decisions are now that of stockbrokers, investment bankers, analysts, and ratings experts. And who is it that these individuals represent? It's not the business, as you would think, but rather it is shareholders and investors. And their concern is not with the business itself, with the day-to-day running of a business, with even what the business is, with the people working in the business, but only with gaining higher and higher returns. And due to the volatility of capital markets and to the high risk involved, these new decision makers have no allegiance to a business, even though these new decision makers are the ones who have sole control over the fate and trajectory of these businesses, these enterprises and services. Just look at private healthcare. The deregulatory history of the US since 1980 has not been the triumph of the citizen over the wishes of the firm, but the exact opposite. It is perhaps no coincidence that the rise of the economic approach to politics has occurred precisely when firms engaged in a massive political and economic effort to reduce the regulatory burden of the state in a successful effort to reduce their costs and restore profits after the 1970s. And what this specifically refers to is May Day, or May 1st, 1975, which was the day when Wall Street changed for good. May Day represents the infamous large-scale deregulation of finance by the New York Stock Exchange. And this is at the root of the explosion of low-commission discount brokers brokers, as well as online discount brokers. And what is distinctive about them is that they allow the everyday average Joe to invest and to trade at a very low commission. And what has accompanied this large-scale deregulation is another explosion in advertising. And what I think is most noticeable about this is that all of this is coated in very specific ideological language. And this ideological language is inherently neoliberal.
In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem. It is time to reawaken this industrial giant, to get government back within its means, and to lighten our punitive tax burden. And these will be our first priorities, and on these principles there will be no compromise.
I believe you won't keep political freedom unless you also have economic freedom, which means that you must have a large part of free enterprise in your whole economy. I don't find it strange, but some other people do, that we have stopped creating wealth. We've had a large number of increasing restrictions, and you've been finding two things. First, that we are more and more concentrating on redistributing the wealth we've got, rather than creating any more. To create more, you need a slightly freer society, and you need an incentive society.
Debt, speculation, risk, and fear are structurally endemic to finance capitalism, in what Alan Walks calls Ponzi neoliberalism. Fear itself becomes the source of further speculation, buying gold or futures, for example. Debt and gambling spread from Wall Street into all sectors of society: house prices, state lotteries, casinos, numbers games, bingo at the church hall, sweepstakes, Pokemon cards. Everyone gambles, even little children. What really stands out to me personally about neoliberalism is that word fear. In 1978, Russian novelist Alexander Solzhenitsyn addressed Harvard graduates in now what is considered an infamous speech. In this speech, he addressed the topic of a decline in courage among Western societies. His speech was more so a critique of capitalism, something which he admired relative to communism in his native Russia. And there is one section of that speech that I would like to focus on. A decline in courage may be the most striking feature which an outside observer notices in the West in our days. The Western world has lost its civil courage, both as a whole and separately, in each country, in each government, each political party, and of course in the United Nations. Such a decline in courage is particularly noticeable among the ruling groups and the intellectual elite, causing an impression of loss of courage by the entire society. Should one point out that from ancient times, declining courage has been considered the beginning of the end. Now, the context in which Solzhenitsyn wrote and delivered this speech is interesting and important to speak about, because this was a period in which finance capitalism was taking over, was cementing its roots. This transition into finance capitalism was undermining some of the gains that had been made by the previous form of capitalism that dominated in Western economies, namely that of managerial, low-growth capitalism. And if we speak specifically about the US, we can see this form of capitalism prior to the onset of finance capitalism in the ideas surrounding the Great Society. Simultaneously, conservative think tanks were being heavily funded. Their growth was largely due to mega funding from businesses and corporations, themselves annoyed and very frustrated with low growth on the one hand, and on the other hand, regulations and fixed rates. And the ideas which spearheaded these think tanks were largely derived from the Mont Pelerin style ideas at the root of a manifesto that came out in 1971, titled Attack on the American Free Enterprise System, written by Lewis Powell Jr. Powell's speech was not an attack against socialism and the Soviet Union, as the title would suggest. Rather, Powell was attacking his very own. He was was attacking pre-neoliberal managerial capitalism and the restructuring of capitalism and its implementation under the policy initiatives of the Great Society. LBJ's Great Society wasn't some radical left-wing big government project and pipe dream. It was moderate, and it worked. Yet what it offered was arguably some of the most ambitious and far-reaching policy initiatives to try and eradicate poverty in the United States and to enact environmental legislation beyond anything we see today. When Solzhenitsyn speaks about a decline in courage, I cannot help but see this transition from rigorous and ambitious policies enacted under the Great Society to the dominance of neoliberal ideas. Finance and business had to govern politics. And this overstep derives from an ideology which has co-opted capitalism for its own ends. It has also inflated the core characteristics of capitalism, virtually redefining it in its own image. Both the Great Society and neoliberalism utilize capitalism in very different ways. One, in my humble opinion, better than the other. One with a lot more courage behind it than the other. And I think we can see that in the outcome of both. The presidential aides who conceived and implemented its component parts rejected policies that would enforce equality of income, wealth, or condition. They did not broadly support quantitative measures like cash transfers or a guaranteed minimum income, but rather believed that qualitative measures like education, workforce training, access to healthcare, food security, and full political empowerment would ensure each American a level playing field and equal opportunity to share in the nation's prosperity. What was critical to the idea of the Great Society is a principle that is characteristic of capitalism, namely citizens' rights. The right of the citizen is integral to the capitalist economy, even if arguably it was an unintentional consequence of some other characteristics of capitalism. In order to have property rights and to participate in the free market economy, one has to have civil rights, one has to have citizen rights. And that is something that we can see underlying the emergence of capitalism throughout history. Now, the discourse of rights has attached very individualistic criteria and traits to it. And I would argue that this is a consequence of neoliberal ideology. The realization of citizen rights and civil rights, namely under the broad heading of a right to self-determination, has characterized capitalism throughout its history, either in the way of denying it to individuals or giving it to individuals, and usually the giving of individuals the right to self-determination through enfranchisement, through permitting equal access to participating in the politics and economy of an age, has not had this added feature of individualism at its core. This is a very recent development, and I would call this the fetishization of individualism to the extent that individualism is now virtually synonymous to rights. And by all means, I am not saying that this is a bad thing, but it is a thing. We seem to find ourselves in a predicament when it comes to individualism, especially as it comes to reconciling it with many of the social ills individuals are increasingly coming face to face with. And this is indeed a predicament. I am highly individualistic and pro-individualism, but a hard truth that I have to reconcile myself to is that that does not exist well or healthily with civil society being upheld. I would also argue that our greater commitment to individualism is a response to growing insecurity in the form of our increased indebtedness, our substantial loss of political power, the fragility of democracy and precariousness, and a need to channel our need for some semblance of control over our lives, over the direction of society and the communities that we are meant to love and be a part of, into that which seemingly cannot be touched by neoliberalism or by modern society, allegedly, the self. Self-determination has moved from being the right of sovereign states to being the right of sovereign individuals, and this is a very recent development. Never before have people in Western societies appreciated and protected their individual personhood, yet I ironically, the political power of these individuals is in decline. The economic power of individuals has declined, and political apathy as a consequence has set in, as finance, not people, determine political decision-making. As the social, political, and economic power of citizens has decreased under neoliberalism, alternative avenues for expression of this wayward power and of this desire to hold at least some fraction of control over one's life have come to the forefront. The major alternative avenues we have seen are identity politics, and neoliberalism has been incredibly successful in Western societies. I cannot deny that. As I've suggested in this video, this is down to the growing influence, the monopoly influence of big business. Just look at how many billions big corporations and big business made during the pandemic years. But we are also responsible to an extent. We have definitely enjoyed and have taken for granted how ideologically driven our commitment to individualism is. Whilst we have been empowered as individuals, we have been disempowered as politically active individuals. We simultaneously have forgotten that for the majority of capitalism's history, it was committed to low growth and not to the levels of high growth and a commitment to profit over all else, which we see today. A characteristic of capitalism is indeed profit, but it is more so the possibility of profit rather than the absolute necessity of profit, which seems to be the obsessive preoccupation today. Capitalism's great breakthrough came in 18th and 19th century Britain, yet the British growth rate never exceeded 2% in any one year. The British success story was rather that an average growth of just above 1% per annum continued for a very long time. In the 20th century, however, the pace quickened. But this obsession with growth is largely a consequence of the nation state. And this is another hard truth that has to be reckoned with. Sovereignty and the nation state are not conducive to the kind of long-term solutions demanded in dealing with, for instance, climate change. Human nature is not conducive to living in the long run. Regulations would not only need to be strictly national, but international. Sovereignty of not only the nation state, but also the individual would have to come second to the primary goal of collective survival of the species in the long run. The problems which we face are far larger and far more complex than just capitalism. Doing away with or placing rigid restraints on capitalism would necessarily and unavoidably mean placing mirroring restrictions and regulations on states' and citizens' rights. The issue we find ourselves in is one that has not been addressed. Regrettably, capitalism's outdated definition has been and likely will continue to be mainstream. And as a result, people are seeing the only alternative possible as being one which is anti-capitalist. And what this means in practice will have horrifying effects for all of us, as well as for the world at large. Fortunately, socialism has never been as weak and unattractive as it is today for the majority of the Western world. Unfortunately, right-wing allegiance to neoliberalism and neoliberal capitalist advocates have never been so strong and enticing to increasingly debt-ridden populations. The former wants to create anew, but also, ironically, wants to hold on to the great triumphs that derive from the history of capitalism, self-determination, individual freedom, and citizen rights. The latter either wants to continue business as usual or dream of returning to a past that never was. What none are willing to do is make compromises on their contradicting and conflicting wants for the future of society and the future of the economy. What none appreciate fully is capitalism's mutability, its ability throughout history to embed itself and re-embed itself. At times, this has been successful. In different parts of the world, this has been more successful and less exploitative than others. But at others, as is the case contemporarily, it has fallen prey to Regina George-ification. And what is at stake is finding new forms of embedding capitalism. And whether this can be done is an open question, and it is one that I cannot answer. Creative destruction has always been key to capitalism, but this video will keep going on and on if I get into that. Do read Schumpeter though. But yes, this was just my very odd odd way of defending capitalism, at least what it potentially could be, and has at points in history been for a lot of people. Inevitably, capitalism is a part of our future. But anyway, that's all from me today. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you once again to Wren for sponsoring this video. Thank you also to my patrons whose support is just unfathomable to me and is incredible. I absolutely adore you, and I appreciate you all considerably for watching and listening to my arguments. Please feel free to include your own arguments down in the comment section below, your own perspective, any critiques, your own experience of capitalism or neoliberalism. So yes, thank you, and I will see you very soon in the next one.